Hello, and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's show, I wanted to talk about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and just a few brief points on how it started and how it evolved and got to where it is today, given the fact that it is being mentioned continuously regarding all the issues that are going on in the world, primarily Donald Trump's desire to annex the territory of Greenland. So without further ado, let's get into it. NATO. If only they knew then what they know now. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was primarily set up as a counterbalance to the Warsaw Pact. This essentially meant that it was there to counter the influence and spread of communism and communist beliefs spread by way of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a military alliance of communist Eastern European countries that was formed by the then USSR. And NATO was obviously set up now to counter their spread of communism around the globe. NATO is an intergovernmental military alliance between 32 members, 30 of which are in Europe, whilst the 2 are in North America, namely the United States of America and Canada. Now bear in mind that NATO was meant to checkmate the Warsaw Pact. We will come back to that a little later. NATO's roots lie in the Atlantic Charter, which was an agreement between the United Kingdom and the United States of America in 1941 for international cooperation without territorial expansion after World War II. It evolved to incorporate the Benelux countries, and it subsequently evolved into the addition of North American countries by way of Canada, and this then led to the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty, which was signed on the 4th of April 1949.
In May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. This had been the price of Europe's unpreparedness. Our hard-won peace seemed at last secure. A few days before, Allied forces from the West had joined hands with the Russians from the East. Their statesmen had met cordially at Yalta and at Potsdam. They had agreed that the countries they had occupied should be truly liberated, and that freely elected governments should be set up as soon as possible. Russia had swallowed up 8 European countries without firing another shot. Great Britain and the United States protested that these countries had been coerced by threat of force and that Russia had broken her treaty. But Russia ignored the protest. On April 4, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed between France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Norway, Denmark, Italy, Portugal, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. The pact was designed to keep within the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter. The treaty members realized that real peace is more than an absence of war, and they seek to promote political and economic stability in the North Atlantic area. To ensure this, they are sworn to stand together against aggression. An attack against one would be an attack against all. This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO.
This treaty was primarily dormant until the beginning of the Korean War, when a military structure was added to it by way of the formation of Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE is the acronym for this, in 1951.
Marly, 15 miles from Paris, General Eisenhower welcomes French President Vincent Auriol to the dedication of the new Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. Story gray concrete building, headquarters for the growing Atlantic Pact Army, is turned over by the French President to the Allied Supreme Commander, who says,
in all history, this is the first time that an Allied headquarters has been set up in peace, to preserve the peace and not to wage war.
As the flags of the 12 Atlantic Pact member nations are raised, a former cabbage patch that was part of the French presidential hunting preserves becomes Western European headquarters in the worldwide struggle for peace.
1952 saw the introduction of the post of Secretary General to NATO. This is important because you find that NATO then began developing into a massive bureaucracy which created hundreds of jobs for North Americans as well as Europeans, and hundreds of millions of dollars were being funneled into NATO to keep this project alive.
And by April 2, 1951,
for many months, the nations of NATO have been engaged in building for themselves a wall of security. They have no aggressive intent or purpose of their own. They desire only to live in peace behind the defenses that they themselves collectively build to protect their own freedoms, which they themselves have earned. Today, another significant step was taken in this process of building a wall of security. Officially and formally, SHAPE headquarters was opened. Its mission is to take charge of all forces allocated by NATO nations to the business of establishing a collective defense for the freedom, peace, and security of Western Europe.
an extensive and detailed plan has been worked out for the defense of Europe. For the purposes of defense, Allied Command, which covers land and sea areas from the northern tip of Norway down to northwest Africa, has been divided into subordinate commands. The Northern Command, with headquarters at Oslo, will include the area from Denmark north. Here, the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Sir Patrick Brind, is responsible for the integration of air, naval, and ground defense. The Southern Command, with headquarters at Naples, includes the area from Italy south. The air, naval, and ground defense in this area is the responsibility of Admiral Robert E. Kearney. In the central area, with headquarters at Fontainebleau, there will be the largest concentration of forces. There are three commands: air, naval, and ground. For the ground forces, the General of the Army, Alphonse Juin. For naval forces, Vice Admiral Robert Jojad. For air forces, Lieutenant General Loris Norstad. It is the responsibility of those 5 subordinate commanders and their integrated staffs to organize and train the national units of soldiers.
So in light of this point, you will now understand why the option of a dissolution of NATO simply does not enter the arena when discussions arise about the dissolution of NATO, because within North America and Western Europe primarily, well, now with the inclusion of some Eastern European countries and Central European countries, you find that there are a lot of people who are employed within this bureaucracy, and lots of money changes hands, and lots of money goes into the funding of NATO as well. So there is a whole ecosystem that is now reliant on the existence of NATO, because should NATO dissolve, these people all become obsolete. Having NATO as this organization that guaranteed democratic values within Europe, as well as the spread of such democratic values all around the globe, meant that the Europeans, or primarily during the Cold War, the Western European nations had become complacent. They became reliant on the fact that the United States of America was always there and always had their back. And this would prove to be an Achilles heel, especially to the Western European nations, because of the position we currently find ourselves in. You find that once the USSR had collapsed and there was no longer a threat from the Warsaw Pact countries, NATO had largely become defunct, because the spread of ideologies from other countries and other organizations could well have been counted by the intelligence agencies each country has, and the amount of information that they share between each other and the agreements that they have. So realistically speaking, there's no need for a NATO, as well as the fact that all this money that is being spent on NATO can be plowed back into the countries, the individual countries, for their own defense, as well as the upkeep of better infrastructure, education, and social policies to help benefit their people. Now, this complacency that I speak of, that the Western Europeans became so accustomed to is now the very same complacency that is causing, meteoric vibrations within NATO as Donald Trump looks to exit NATO, looks to annex Greenland, and these are scenarios that I can assure you, when NATO was being formed, never for one moment crept into the wildest imaginations of those involved in the founding of NATO. Now, despite the fact that NATO had become defunct as a result of the collapse of the USSR, NATO quickly then rebranded and recharacterized its role within the global community and global affairs. You then find that NATO becomes embroiled in the war in Bosnia, as well as the destabilization of Libya, just to name a few. You also find that once the Soviet Union had dissolved, NATO began creeping up to the Russian borders. And they slowly embarked on a policy of including countries one at a time on their path towards countering or containing Russia. So Ukraine and Georgia were the two countries that I think the old Soviet Guard and including the new Russian administration had said they would not tolerate, because that would be too close for comfort for the Russians. Now, all the while NATO kept creeping up to Russia's borders, it kept citing the threat of an imminent invasion from the Russians onto NATO allies' territories.
Finland is officially a member of NATO. An accession document was handed to the US Secretary of State, formally cementing the country as the 31st member of the military alliance. The expansion, triggered by the invasion of Ukraine, roughly doubles the length of the border that NATO shares with Russia. The Kremlin has warned the move, which encroaches on its security, raises the risk of conflict and said it would be forced to take countermeasures.
Or Russian incursions into Western Europe, because they cite Ukraine as an example of Vladimir Putin's desire to reawaken the old Soviet empire and reclaim territories that were lost as a result of the dissolution thereof. I have to say, personally, I think that that's a load of hogwash. However, NATO seemed to have been confident that that would be the case, and that was the premise for their very existence.
NATO is urging Western allies to ramp up their defences, claiming Russia could be ready to launch an attack on NATO within just 5 years. The military alliance's chief, Mark Rutte, urged members to scale up their defence spending in a keynote address in Berlin. He says Russia has its eyes set on NATO 4 years on since the start of their onslaught in Ukraine.
However, little did they know that the threat towards their existence was not the Russians, but rather a threat, a far more sinister and insidious threat that lurked from within.
And I also have a message tonight for the incredible people of Greenland. We strongly support your right to determine your own future. And if you choose, we welcome you into the United States of America. We need Greenland for national security and even international security, and we're working with everybody involved to try and get it. But we need it really for international world security. And I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
Because if you look at it from NATO's point, what is currently happening with Greenland and Donald Trump's threats to impose tariffs, and should they fail, impose further tariffs. And then once you get to a point where the tariffs are not enough, the threat of military action has been branded around. And, the basis of this is that you find that the threat to NATO that they perceived as coming from the Russians all along has never materialized. However, that threat is actually coming from within.
Are you willing to leave the NATO alliance in order to get what you want with Greenland? What are the options right
I
now?
wouldn't be telling you what I'm willing to do, certainly. I'm not going to give up options, but it's very important. Greenland is very important for the national security, including of Denmark. And the problem is not a thing that Denmark can do about it if Russia or China wants to occupy Greenland. But there's everything we can do. You found that out last week with Venezuela. There's everything we can do about things such as that. Not going to happen. We're not, I can't rely on Denmark being able to fend themselves off. They were talking about they put an extra dog, and they were serious about this. They put an extra dog sled there.
So they had effectively let a fox into the henhouse. I have to say that the founders of NATO, when they sat down to draft the treaty and the signatories to the treaty, probably sat down thinking that the spread of communism was a certain threat to their way of life, and they envisaged it as the USSR as being this behemoth that was going to threaten their way of life. Now, I don't think for one moment they anticipated that the threat to NATO and its very existence would actually come from within. So I have to say they're probably turning in their graves right now when they're looking at current world events and what is going on regarding the annexation of Greenland by Donald Trump. I hope you enjoyed this short video, and please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps our channel to grow. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.